Anglo-Americans are Americans with ancestry that comes partly or entirely from England. This term is different from British Americans, which includes not just English Americans, but also those with roots in Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and the Channel Islands. In the 2020 U.S. Census, English Americans were the largest self-identified ancestral group, with 46.6 million people claiming some English heritage. That made up about 19.8% of the white American population, though many of them also have mixed ancestry. Even though English Americans form the largest ancestral group, experts believe their actual numbers are undercounted. This is because their ancestors arrived over 400 years ago, during the colonial era, and many people today either don't realize they have English roots or prefer to identify with a more recent heritage, despite English often being their primary background. Throughout most of U.S. history, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have played a dominant role in American society, culture, and politics. Most U.S. presidents, as well as a majority of current and past members of Congress, come from families of English descent. The founding fathers of the United States were largely of English ancestry, and prestigious Ivy League universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were established by and traditionally composed of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Why did people of English descent become the most dominant group in the United States, both in numbers and influence? From the earliest colonial settlements to their lasting impact on American society, the history of Anglo-Americans is a story of migration, expansion, and power. But how did they get here, and what led to their rise? In this video, we'll explore the journey of the English to the American continent, the factors that drove their migration, and how they came to shape the nation's identity, politically, culturally, and socially. Starting in the 15th century, the lure of gold, silver, spices, and new trade opportunities drove European explorers to claim vast lands across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. While the first recorded European settlement in the Americas was established by Norse explorers around the year 1000 in what is now Newfoundland, known to them as Vinland, major European expansion didn't begin until much later. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, opened the door for Spain and Portugal to establish colonies in the New World, kicking off the European colonization of the Americas. Not wanting to be left behind, France and England also sent their own explorers. In 1497, King Henry VII of England commissioned John Cabot to explore North America's coast. Cabot's voyages in 1497 and 1498 confirmed the existence of the continent, but since he found no gold or other valuable resources, neither England nor Spain saw much reason to settle there in the early 16th century. For nearly a century, large-scale colonization in North America stalled, but English fishermen became increasingly active near Newfoundland. The rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks attracted European fleets, and trade soon developed with indigenous peoples, exchanging metal, glass, and cloth for food and fur. By the mid-1580s, English naval commander Bernard Drake launched an expedition to Newfoundland, dealing a heavy blow to Spanish and Portuguese fishing operations. This shift would have lasting consequences, helping pave the way for England's colonial expansion and eventual settlement in North America. By the late 16th century, Protestant England was locked in a bitter religious conflict with Catholic Spain. At the same time, England's rising merchant class was both envious and alarmed by the enormous wealth Spain was extracting from its American colonies. Spanish gold and power weren't just economic threats, they also endangered England's independence and its newly established Protestant faith. To counter Spain's dominance, England celebrated its sea dogs, like Sir John Hawkins, Sir Francis Drake, Sir Richard Grenville, and Thomas Cavendish, who raided Spanish treasure ships and settlements, seizing gold, silver, jewels, spices, and valuable resources. These daring attacks hinted at the vast riches waiting in the New World. One of the first to propose English colonization was privateer Humphrey Gilbert, who believed England should follow Spain's example by building a profitable empire in North America. Colonies wouldn't just expand England's reach, they would also serve as strategic bases for attacking Spanish ships. After Gilbert's death, Walter Raleigh took up the mission, organizing an expedition of 500 men to Roanoke Island. There, they encountered indigenous peoples for the first time, studied their farming techniques, shelter construction, and even searched for valuable minerals. In 1584, they established what was intended to be the first permanent English colony in North America. However, the settlers were unprepared for the challenges of the New World. and by 1590 had mysteriously vanished. A separate attempt to establish a colony in Newfoundland also ended in failure. Despite these early setbacks, England remained determined to establish a foothold in North America, both for economic gain and to challenge Spanish dominance in the Atlantic. In 1606, King James I of England granted the first charter of Virginia, allowing investors in the Virginia Company to establish a colony in North America. The charter created two branches, one in London and the other in Plymouth. A year later, in 1607, 3 ships set sail from England, led by Captain Christopher Newport, who had been hired by the London Company. The expedition arrived at Cape Henry in April and went on to establish a permanent settlement at Jamestown, located on the Chesapeake Bay. The second major English colony was Plymouth, founded in 1620 by a group later known as the Pilgrims. These settlers, originally from the East Midlands of England, were Puritans who practiced a strict form of Calvinist Protestantism and wanted to separate from the Church of England. Seeking religious freedom, they first moved to Holland, but feared losing their English identity. To start a new life while preserving their culture, they decided to journey to the New World, with financial backing from English investors. In September 1620, 102 passengers boarded the Mayflower and arrived at Plymouth in November. The first winter was brutal, with nearly half of the settlers dying. However, in 1621, they formed an alliance with the nearby Wampanoag tribe, who taught them vital agricultural techniques and helped establish a trade network based on furs and other goods. Meanwhile, farther north, the English founded the Newfoundland colony in 1610. Unlike Jamestown and Plymouth, which focused on settlement and agriculture, Newfoundland was primarily established for its rich cod fishing industry. Several English colonies were established under a system of proprietary governors, meaning they were run by individuals or joint stock companies granted charters by the English crown. These companies were responsible for funding and managing the settlements, with each colony governed by a local council of 13 members. A separate council in England, also consisting of 13 members, oversaw colonial affairs and advised the king on matters related to the New World. To facilitate trade between the colonies and indigenous peoples, the governing councils were even given the authority to mint their own coins using whatever metals and designs they saw fit. However, life in the colonies, especially in Jamestown, was brutally difficult. The settlers faced fires, food shortages, outbreaks of disease in the summer, and frequent conflicts with indigenous groups. Of the 1,500 colonists who had arrived in Jamestown by 1617, only 351 had survived. Things changed when the settlers discovered the profitability of growing tobacco. By 1617, the population had grown to 400, and by 1622, it had exploded to 1,240. However, this rapid expansion also led to frequent conflicts with local indigenous tribes. The London Company, which managed Jamestown, struggled financially due to these conflicts. The breaking point came in 1622, when a major indigenous uprising resulted in the deaths of 300 to 400 settlers. The survivors took refuge in their fortifications, but were unable to farm or hunt, leading to widespread starvation and disease. As the colony's population plummeted, King James blamed the London Company for failing to properly supply and defend the settlement. As a result, he revoked its charter and, on March 24, 1624, declared Virginia a royal colony, placing it directly under the Crown's control. After the success of the Jamestown and Plymouth colonies, more English settlers arrived, leading to the establishment of several new colonies in the region that would later be called New England. In 1629, a group of Puritans led by John Winthrop founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. By 1635, around 10,000 English settlers were living in the area between the Connecticut River and the Kennebec River. After defeating the Pequot people in the Pequot War, Puritan settlers took over their lands and established the Connecticut colony. Meanwhile, Roger Williams, a Puritan leader who had been expelled from Massachusetts for advocating a complete break from the Church of England, founded the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Unlike the more fertile southern colonies, New England's colder climate and rocky soil made large-scale farming difficult. Instead, settlers relied on fishing and long-distance trade to sustain their economy. The Pilgrims who settled at Plymouth were particularly distinct. They weren't motivated by the Crown, but instead sought refuge from what they saw as religious extremism in the Church of England. Their focus was on smaller farms rather than the large plantations that developed in the South. This fundamental difference between New England and the southern colonies would shape regional identities for centuries to come. New England's location along the Atlantic coast provided an abundance of sea life and excellent natural harbors, making maritime trade essential to its economy. By the late 1600s, New England merchants had built an extensive Atlantic trade network, connecting them to England, the slave coast of West Africa, the plantations of the West Indies, and the Iberian Peninsula. The colonists depended on British and European imports for glass, linens, hardware, and household goods, reinforcing their economic ties to the broader Atlantic world. England also took control of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which had been established in 1614 and covered parts of what are now New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Connecticut, and Delaware. 5 years before that, Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, had explored the Hudson Bay area, traded furs with Native Americans, and claimed the land for the Dutch Republic. In 1621, the Dutch government granted the newly formed West India Company a monopoly over the fur trade along the Hudson River. The first Dutch colonists arrived in 1624, and as European powers competed for land in the Americas, the Dutch built forts to protect their interests. One of the main trading posts, Fort Orange, was established in present-day Albany, while another, Fort Amsterdam, was built on the southern tip of Manhattan Island to protect incoming ships and secure the river's entrance. The settlement there, New Amsterdam, became the administrative center of New Netherland. Over the next 55 years, the colony grew into an important hub of trade, drawing immigrants from across Europe, including the English, Germans, Walloons, and Sephardic Jews. At its peak, about 9,000 people lived in New Netherland, and the colony dominated the regional fur trade. It also became a key player in transatlantic commerce, shipping goods from New England and Virginia to Europe. The Dutch were also involved in the Atlantic slave trade, bringing enslaved Africans to North America. However, despite its economic success, New Netherland failed to attract as many settlers as the English colonies. In 1664, the English seized control of the colony, but its Dutch influence remained deeply embedded in the region's culture, language, place names, food, and business practices, many of which are still evident in New York City today. The English renamed New Amsterdam as New York City, and with New Netherland under their rule, they also took over the former Swedish colony of New Sweden in present-day Delaware, which the Dutch had previously captured from Sweden. This land eventually became part of Pennsylvania. While some Dutch settlers left, many stayed, particularly in the rural areas between Manhattan and Albany. Meanwhile, New Englanders and German immigrants also began moving in. New York City quickly became a diverse and cosmopolitan hub, home to a significant enslaved black population as well as traders and settlers from a wide range of backgrounds. In 1632, Cecil Calvert, the second Baron Baltimore, founded the province of Maryland just north of Virginia. Together, Maryland and Virginia became known as the Chesapeake Colonies, sharing similar patterns of immigration and economic development. Although the Calvert family originally envisioned Maryland as a refuge for Catholics facing persecution in England, the colony mostly attracted Protestant settlers. Many of these Protestants opposed the Calvert family's policy of religious tolerance, which led to tensions in the colony. The first Southern colonies were primarily driven by the pursuit of profit. The earliest settlers in Virginia were adventurers hoping to find gold or establish new trade routes. When those ambitions didn't pan out, they turned to farming instead. Many of these settlers had enough wealth to purchase large plots of land, laying the foundation for a plantation-based economy centered around crops like cotton, tobacco, and indigo. This plantation system depended heavily on enslaved labor and indentured servitude. By the mid-17th century, the Chesapeake colonies began importing large numbers of enslaved Africans, forcibly taken from their homelands and brought to America to work without pay. Some early enslaved people managed to earn their freedom, but by 1662, Virginia enacted laws that made enslavement hereditary. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved for life. These laws also gave slave owners almost absolute control over the lives of their human property. As the plantation economy grew, so did the slave trade, with markets and auctions becoming a common part of life in the South. Spain had established several small outposts in Florida by the early 16th century, the most significant being St. Augustine, which was founded in 1565, alongside Mission Nombre de Dios. St. Augustine became the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is now the United States, but it was repeatedly attacked and burned by pirates, privateers, and English forces. Despite these challenges, it remained under Spanish control until 1763, when Spain traded Florida to Great Britain in exchange for Havana, Cuba, which the British had captured during the 7 Years' War. At the time, Florida's Spanish population numbered around 3,000, nearly all of whom left for Spanish territories after the transfer. The British occupied Florida, but did not make substantial efforts to establish a significant settler population in the region. As English colonies grew, they faced increasing threats from indigenous groups, the French and the Dutch. As early as the 1640s, efforts began to establish common defense strategies. The Puritan colonies of New England formed a loose confederation to coordinate military and judicial affairs, allowing them to respond collectively to external threats. After King Philip's War, Andros played a key role in negotiating the Covenant Chain, a series of treaties with the Iroquois Confederacy that helped maintain relative peace along the frontiers of the Middle Colonies. This agreement strengthened alliances between the English and certain indigenous groups, ensuring a measure of stability for several years. However, as colonial expansion continued, tensions with both Native American nations and European rivals remained an ongoing challenge. Cultural similarities and a shared language allowed English immigrants to integrate swiftly into the American colonies, fostering the development of a unique Anglo-American identity. Even after the United States declared independence, English immigration remained substantial, with an estimated 3.5 million English immigrants arriving after 1776. Throughout the 19th century, settlers from England continued to provide a steady influx of new citizens, reinforcing the cultural and political influence of their predecessors. The early Anglo-Protestant settlers, particularly in the 17th century, established themselves as the dominant group in the colonies, shaping the economic, political, and legal foundations of what would become the United States. They held key positions in government, frequently drawing upon their experiences in English administration. Many of the early laws in the 13 colonies were rooted in English common law, preserving a legal continuity that extended into the foundation of the new nation. The majority of the founding fathers of the United States were of English descent, and among them, a smaller elite class, often referred to as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASPs, held considerable influence. However, a portion of this elite, particularly those who remained loyal to the British Crown, left the country following the American Revolution. The ideological underpinnings of the American Revolution and the New Republic were deeply influenced by England's own history of political and religious struggles. The Puritans, in particular, sought to establish a society based on biblical teachings, an ambition that aligned with broader efforts in England to limit monarchical power. These struggles culminated in the execution of King Charles I in 1649, and the rise of a parliamentary system that sought to curb absolute rule. Though the monarchy was restored in 1660, tensions between Protestant reformers and royal authority persisted. A turning point came in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, when the Catholic King James II was overthrown and replaced by Protestant rulers William and Mary. This shift in power was formalized in the English Bill of Rights of 1689, a revolutionary document that established key principles of constitutional governance, including the protection of individual rights and limits on monarchical authority. This document would later serve as a crucial blueprint for the American Bill of Rights, drafted over a century later. Ironically, while the principles of the Glorious Revolution were gradually undermined in England during the 18th century, especially under the rule of the Hanoverian kings, such as George III, they remained a powerful force in the American colonies. The colonies became a haven for the ideals of political and religious reform, fueled by two key movements: the series of Protestant religious revivals, known as the Great Awakening, which spanned from the 1730s to the 1760s, and the spread of Enlightenment thought. The growing discontent among American colonists was driven by what they perceived as violations of their rights under the English Bill of Rights. The most egregious of these was the imposition of taxes without representation, as Parliament passed legislation that financially burdened the colonies while denying them any voice in government. These mounting frustrations, combined with other royal abuses, ultimately led to the American Revolution in 1776. The principles that had once inspired reforms in England found their fullest expression not in the mother country, but in the birth of a new republic that sought to enshrine them permanently. The founding fathers of the early American Republic had spent their lives as British subjects, and at the time of the Revolution, the idea of being American was still novel and uncertain. They had grown up identifying with British customs, laws, and political institutions, yet many of them, like countless other colonists, had personal or ancestral ties to those who had left Great Britain seeking refuge from religious persecution, social oppression, or economic hardship. These experiences made them particularly sensitive to issues of political and religious rights, often in ways that went beyond the concerns of the average Englishman. By the mid-18th century, a growing number of colonists viewed British rule as tyrannical, a sentiment fueled by repeated violations of their perceived rights as Englishmen. When the time came to establish their own independent government, they sought to construct it on principles that stood in direct opposition to the monarchical system they had rebelled against. This opposition was rooted in two fundamental ideas. First, they believed the executive branch of their new government should have its powers strictly limited by an elected legislative body that truly represented the people, what would become the U.S. Congress. Second, they determined that, unlike in Britain, no single church would hold official status in the new nation. Religious liberty, rather than a state-sanctioned faith, would be a defining characteristic of the United States. At the same time, English Protestantism was evolving in another direction, intertwining with a broader vision of national and racial identity. This vision portrayed the English as a uniquely chosen people, an Anglo-Saxon nation with a divine mission to spread civilization, culture, and Protestant Christianity across the world. Often referred to as Anglo-Saxonism, this ideology is frequently associated with the Romantic nationalism of the 18th and 19th centuries. However, its roots stretch back much further, emerging from the spread of Protestantism in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Protestant Reformation in 15th century Germany was driven by a desire to break free from Roman Catholic control. Martin Luther's teachings, combined with emerging Germanic ethnic consciousness, fueled hostility towards Southern European Catholics. The Roman historian Tacitus influenced this mindset with his book Germania, which praised Germanic moral and martial virtues, emphasizing their racial purity. His work, translated into German in 1500, strengthened Germanic pride and Protestant opposition to Catholic nations. English reformers later used Tacitus's critiques of Rome to condemn Catholic corruption, likening Protestantism to the Germanic tribes that overthrew the Roman Empire. This led to efforts to erase Catholic and Irish influences from English Christianity, with figures like John Bale arguing that evangelical Christianity had earlier roots in England. During the 17th century, Puritan supporters of Parliament saw it as a revival of the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot, a democratic council where kings were elected for wartime leadership. This view justified their opposition to the monarchy, which they associated with Catholic and Norman French influence. The absolutism of Louis XIV reinforced their belief in limiting royal power. Puritans embraced the New Testament's vision of egalitarianism, but within an Anglo-Saxonist framework, using it to justify British colonialism and later, America's manifest destiny. This ideology, emphasizing English moral and racial superiority, linked Protestantism with Anglo-Saxon identity, shaping the WASP myth. Early British colonists envisioned a strictly European Protestant society, excluding and punishing non-conforming elements. Although slavery was not essential to the northern colonies' economy, Puritans were the first to provide religious justification for it, a stance later adopted by southern plantation owners. Viewing themselves as God's chosen people, akin to the ancient Jews, they aimed to build a perfect Christian nation in New England, calling it New Canaan or New Zion. By the 19th century, Americans saw themselves as the pinnacle of the Anglo-Saxon lineage, having established the freest nation on earth. Well into the 20th century, being American was closely associated with being part of the WASP mainstream, specifically of British, Scots-Irish, or Western European Protestant descent. The early British colonies were overwhelmingly dominated by English, Welsh, Scottish, and Ulster, Scots-Irish Protestants, shaping the cultural and political foundations of America. By 1790, about 85% of the European origin population in North America was of British or Scots-Irish Protestant descent, while German pacifists, as well as smaller groups of French, Dutch, and Swedish Protestants, made up another 10%. Catholics, mainly in Maryland and the Carolinas, remained a minority overshadowed by Protestant arrivals. Alongside European settlers, 757,208 Africans, nearly 700,000 of whom were enslaved, lived in the colonies, laboring under harsh conditions, with no influence on the dominant cultural or political structures. Native Americans, completely excluded, fared even worse. The first major disruption to America's religious and cultural stability came with the mass arrival of over 1 million impoverished Irish Catholics in the 1840s and 1850s. Viewed with disdain by the WASP majority, they entered the country just as the U.S. was undergoing significant geographic expansion. The American Civil War, 1861-1865, marked the second major disruption to WASP dominance. Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation freed 4 million African slaves, triggering a long struggle for racial equality that continues to shape the nation. In theory, Black Americans were granted the same constitutional rights as WASPs, but deep social and political resistance remained. Despite the unrest, the war accelerated industrialization in the North, making the U.S. a global powerhouse by 1900. However, this industrial expansion required massive labor, and with many British workers opting for other Commonwealth nations, millions of impoverished Southern and Eastern European immigrants, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews arrived to fill the workforce. While industrialists welcomed the cheap labor, widespread resentment toward non-WASPs grew. As urban centers became the economic and political hubs, immigrants concentrated in these areas, gradually shifting power away from WASP-dominated rural regions. Despite initial hostility, most new immigrants sought to assimilate, embracing English and even anglicizing their names to fit the American identity. Public education became a key tool for assimilation. By 1918, all states had public school systems, many rooted in colonial-era policies that promoted English literacy and Protestant values. Since WASP still controlled much of the country's institutions, schools played a crucial role in integrating immigrant children into the dominant cultural framework. By the early 20th century, the idea of American national identity, based on Protestant and Caucasian heritage, became increasingly problematic as the population grew more diverse. Many non-Protestants, non-Caucasians, and non-Christians, though legally citizens, were not fully accepted as part of the American nation. Major blow to WASP dominance came with the rise of Nazi Germany. Unlike Anglo-Saxonists, the Nazis rejected Christianity and pursued extreme racial policies, committing genocide in ways that even shocked many racial supremacists in Britain and America. Ironically, the US and Britain, despite their own histories of racial exclusion, were now fighting a war against a Teutonic regime that shared many ideological similarities with Anglo-Saxonism. However, wartime propaganda framed them as defenders of democracy and human rights, exposing deep contradictions that liberal intellectuals would later criticize. The most affected by these contradictions were colonial subjects and marginalized Americans. With Britain and France weakened after World War II, nearly all their colonies gained independence between 1945 and 1965, often through violent struggles. The U.S., while officially opposing colonialism, gradually assumed a neo-colonial role, inheriting global resentment. Inspired by these decolonization movements, non-European Americans sought social and legal equality. Martin Luther King Jr. adopted Gandhi's nonviolent resistance strategies, effectively challenging racial segregation. The brutal repression of Black protesters by Southern authorities exposed the moral bankruptcy of white supremacy, drawing support from liberal whites, Jews, and other minorities. Global human rights groups condemned American racism, while the Soviet Union and leftist European allies exploited the situation, making the civil rights struggle an international issue.